White nights is a phenomenon particularly associated with the Russian city of St. Petersburg. I've been there and I've seen it, and it is quite incredible when the sky doesn't really go dark and all through the night. In fact, all that happens is you get a sort of twilight for a little while and then the sun rises again. It's a time when people really celebrate with, and sometimes quite wildly. There's masses of drinking and lots of partying going on the side, on the streets and things like that. The two outer works in the concert in many ways celebrate that mood of festivity. The first of these is a little piece by a composer you may not have heard of called Anatoly Liadov. Now, Liadov could have been a much bigger name if he'd managed to fulfill a commission that came to him in the early 20th century when the great Russian ballet impresario Sergei Dogadin asked him if he'd write a score for a ballet he had in mind on the old Russian legend of The Firebird. And if that does ring a bell, you'll remember that in fact the commission eventually went to a then virtually unknown composer called Igor Stravinsky. Why didn't Liadov do it? Well, the trouble is Liadov is one of the great might-have-beens in Russian music. He was clearly enormously talented, great imagination, as this little piece shows. But he seems to have had a very sort of, well, kind of depressive tendency, which was made much worse by that old enemy of Russian composers, alcohol. In fact, Liadov is quite possibly that he was so drunk at the time that Diaghilev approached him, or so dependent on the bottle that he just wasn't able to fulfill the commission at all. And so Stravinsky got the commission to write The Firebird. If he hadn't, it's arguable the whole history of 20th century music, or certainly 20th century classical music, would have been radically different. This little piece is called Baba-Yaga. You may know the name from Mussorgsky's famous Pictures at an Exhibition. She's an old legend in Russian folktale, a witch, a hideous witch, who eats people, eats children, I think, in some versions of the stories. And she drives around in a house that's on hen's legs. And she moves her along with a pestle and mortar. She's a terrifying one, I think with iron teeth in some depictions as well. And so this little piece depicts her in her flight, but it's not quite as terrifying as Mussorgsky's. It's much more colorful and impressionistic. And it gives you a feeling of just how wonderfully Liadov might have written music for the Firebird ballet story if he hadn't had that terrible capacity to shoot himself in the foot. Well, let's be thankful for what we have, because in its way, Baba-Yaga is a little gem. And I hope it'll inspire you to have a look out one or two other little gems of Liadov. They're well worth it. At the end of the program, we have one of the colorful classics of Russian music, certainly of 19th century Russian music, Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade. It's a sort of symphony and a tone poem at the same time. 4 movements that all tell stories from the great Arabian collection of folk tales, The 1001 Nights. Russia was expanding her borders imperially in Rimsky-Korsakov's lifetime, and he saw a lot of this because in his younger days, he was an officer in the Russian Navy. And you might be struck by the fact that ships appear in 2 of the 4 movements of Scheherazade. In the first movement, which tells of Sinbad the sailor's flight through the waves and his great ship, and finally in the last movement, where a ship crashes and is wrecked towards the end. In the middle, we have the young prince who goes on a series of wild adventures. You really don't need to know much about the story to be carried away by it. This is music that tells its own story vividly, almost as brilliantly as some of those early film scores and cartoon scores that came out of Hollywood so marvelously. And then the third movement is a beautiful love scene between the young prince and princess. Incredibly tender. At every stage, as I said, this music is so vividly illustrative, and yet perhaps in the end, because Rimsky didn't provide a very detailed program note explaining Scheherazade, perhaps he knew that in the end, it's best if you can leave people to dream their own stories for themselves. It's more creative. And in a way, I think that's one of the things that music can do for us. It can suggest lines of imaginative inquiry for us. It can suggest journeys that we can go on. At the same time, music isn't words. It doesn't tell us precisely what we're going to hear. and it's up to us to make of it what we will. But actually, some of the older members of the audience may recognize a couple of the tunes and ideas from this piece because they were used in radio drama quite a lot. And I think that the old series Dick Barton's Special Agent used one theme that appears right throughout the cycle. So you may find your imagination or your memory triggered by certain things in this music. But between these comes something, if I say it's much more serious, that might sound daunting, but actually Shostakovich's first violin concerto is one of, I think, the outstanding masterpieces of the whole Russian repertory. Shostakovich had a bit of a roller coaster career in Stalin's Russia. One moment he would be the favorite, lauded, provided with decorations. The next moment he might find himself condemned, either in the pages of the newspaper Pravda or in 1948 at the first Congress of the Soviet Union of Composers, where Shostakovich was denounced as a bourgeois formalist and an enemy of the people. It doesn't get much worse in communist terms. And for a while, Shostakovich found that it was hard enough to make a living. He lost his teaching jobs, his main pieces weren't being performed, and it was difficult to make ends meet. It was during this time that he realized that in order to survive, what he had to do was write the kind of music that the authorities wanted, the propaganda stuff, which would keep him alive, and buy him the time to write the things he really wanted to in private. But when he wrote the first violin concerto, he may have wondered whether he'd ever hear it performed. It's not the kind of thing that Stalin and his authorities wanted in those days. It's dark, it's searching, it confronts feelings of loneliness, of pain, of grief head on. And yet, having said that, there is so often with Shostakovich something marvelously affirmative about this music in the end. He seems to be saying, it's worth going on this journey because if you come out the other end, you'll come out stronger. You can feel sometimes in Shostakovich's music how it was that he found the strength to keep going. And this magnificent big violin concerto, I think, is one of the best examples of that. Begins with a fabulous movement called Nocturne, which at this stage Shostakovich was writing a lot of his music at night. And you can imagine him doing so somewhere far away, removed from Moscow, perhaps, out in the country. It may be his country home, his dacha. The stillness of the night is all around. Dark thoughts are somewhere in the background, but it's also very beautiful. Then there's a kind of wild dance in the second movement with some fabulously virtuosic writing for the violin. Then after that comes an amazing movement, a slow movement of great power and grandeur, based on the kind of structures that Bach used to build. It's on the one hand an extraordinary outpouring of grief and sadness for what Shostakovich knew was happening to his home country. And yet at the same time, it has colossal dignity. There's something wonderfully moving and affirmative even in this music. Then begins a solo cadenza. Actually, it's really more like a movement in its own right. It starts very slowly, as though Shostakovich is interrogating himself alone and in silence. But gradually it begins to build, gets faster and faster. The writing becomes more and more dance-like until finally it erupts into an incredible dance finale in which Shostakovich imitates the sounds of mouth organs and harmonicas and squeeze boxes and all this kind of thing. You can imagine a real vigorous Russian dance going on. And this is Shostakovich, I think, it is most remarkable. This isn't outright rejoicing. It isn't as though Shostakovich is saying, I've got through that. You can still hear strong elements of doubt. Shostakovich's his future is by no means certain at this stage, but it's almost as though he's saying, in spite of this, I'm still standing, not just still standing, I'm still dancing. And that quality comes out right at the end of this concerto. It's no wonder when you hear it, I think, that you'll discover that at its first performance, when it was performed some years after he wrote it, it was encored. And actually later, there was an arrangement for the Red Army Balalaika band. Can you imagine that? It was so popular. It has that quality. It's rejoicing through gritted teeth, you might say. But at the same time, this is the music of a man who you feel is determined to survive. And survive he did. And his music goes on speaking to us in troubled times like those now, of why, I think, even when the worst is around you, it's incredibly important to keep going.